"Ambulance, what's your emergency?" A rough female voice came through the receiver. The boy on the other end of the line became flustered. "I need help. My stepfather isn't home and I've cut myself. Also, I have a very high temperature." The dispatcher with bleached curls sighed. "What's your temperature?" "Well, it's somewhere around 40 or even 50 deg," he replied. "I'm not sure exactly if the thermometer is up high, but I can tell I'm feeling really sick." At that moment, a colleague, Dr. Jessica, entered the room. A young, dark-haired woman, tall and slender. The white coat accentuated her tan skin. Her brown eyes looked penetrating. "Got a call?" Jessica asked. "Nah, just some troublemaker messing around. First he says he's got a 50 deg temperature. Then he says he's cut himself." Gwen frowned. "All right, give me the headset," she requested. Reluctantly, the dispatcher got up, yielding her spot to the doctor. "I'm listening," Gwen replied. "I need help," the boy began. This time he said he had a fever and a stomach ache. Gwen sighed. The boy seemed worried but clearly confused about his symptoms and couldn't articulate them properly. All he insisted on was that he needed help and it had to come quickly. "All right, give me the address," Gwen said. She took the call herself, stepping out into the courtyard. It was getting dark. The end of March had been warm and quiet. The snow had almost melted. The air cooled at night but still carried the scent of warmth. The ambulance driver, a balding man in his 40s, was smoking by the car with Jessica, the dispatcher. "So did you take the call?" she asked disdainfully. The hospital didn't appreciate the young, meticulous specialist. Gwen followed all the rules and regulations. She was as meticulous as the devil and never refused patients, even if they didn't have insurance, citing the infamous Hippocratic oath. "Take it. We're going," she calmly told the driver. "Drive if you need to. Only 20 minutes left of the shift." The kid called. "It's a false alarm." The driver snorted. Since Gwen started working at this hospital, he had repeatedly shown her attention. Even back when Gwen was still married to Lucas, David was the driver on her shift and fell in love. In the first years of her work, Gwen and Lucas were just dating. They got married in the third year when they thought they would soon have a child. All that time, David secretly swore his love to her despite her sharp rejections and threats of complaints. Gwen was not one to flirt or cheat, and David fell deeply in love with her. A week before the scheduled wedding, Gwen had a miscarriage. Lucas wanted to call off the wedding, because by then he had already set his eyes on the daughter of the head physician who, though older, still appealed to him. Out of pity for Gwen, Lucas didn't leave her immediately after the miscarriage. They got married and lived together for another year. During that year, Lucas cheated on her with Kelly. Everyone in the hospital knew about it except Gwen. When she found out, she immediately filed for divorce. Lucas stayed with Kelly, and they quickly got married. This helped him become the head of pulmonology, with the help of his father-in-law, of course. Now they were an official couple, and Gwen remained alone, dedicating herself entirely to work. She continued to work on the ambulance with David. He was overjoyed that his colleague was now single and continued his courtship, but each time he was met with rejection. A month ago, he got drunk, came to Gwen's house, and caused a scene. He yelled under her windows that he loved her and couldn't live without her. He begged for a chance. Neighbors called the police, putting Gwen in a difficult position. Sobering up, David called a friend who was a cop, and they let him go. "I'll tell the chief about this incident. He might not like me, but there's a police protocol, and my address is in it. Everyone knows the chief doesn't favor me, but they'll believe a document from the police for sure. If you come near me again or even hint at anything, I'll write an official complaint." She threatened him with that, and David got scared. Since then, he only cast glances at her and remained silent, nursing his grudge. He didn't want to obey anymore. Gwen looked sternly at the driver and crossed her arms over her chest. "All right, I'll write up an official form stating that the driver refused to respond to the call. So what if it was a kid calling? Who are you to decide not to go? It's your job. You can't decide who gets help and who doesn't. Right now, you're standing here and someone's life, a child's life, could be on the line. Either you get in the car and drive me there or I'll call a taxi. But then it's on you. You'll be out of here in a flash." Gwen grew angry, worried about the boy. Sure, he was lying. But what if the reason for the call was much more serious than he described? What if he simply couldn't articulate it at the moment? What if the child was in trouble? How could anyone refuse a patient? False alarms essentially didn't exist except in cases of real mischief, which were extremely rare. David flicked his cigarette and got into the car, slamming the door loudly. The dispatcher gave Gwen a disdainful look. Gwen, unperturbed, took her usual seat and buried herself in her phone. Throughout the drive, David remained silent, not even turning on the radio, which was unusual. At the address, Gwen double-checked the apartment number and got out. "If this call turns out to be false, I'll file a complaint against you," the driver snorted. Gwen didn't dignify his jab with a response. She climbed to the second floor, rang the doorbell. "Who's there?" A child's voice came through. "My name is Gwen. I'm a doctor. "We spoke on the phone," she said loudly. The door opened, and Gwen saw an 8-year-old boy standing before her. He had dark hair, a freckled nose, and a bowl cut. He wore a gray-stained tank top, and the house looked unkempt. "Where are your parents?" Gwen asked. "My mom's not here, and my dad, stepdad, he's still at work. He's always late. They drink there all the time. Please don't scold me. I'll show you why I called. But it's very important." Really, the boy opened the door, revealing a dog. Its fur was stained with blood, and it lay on the floor, whimpering. Beside it was a bowl of milk, but the dog had no appetite. "You called me because of him." Gwen realized she was in a difficult position. "He'll die on the street. I saw a mean homeless guy stab him with a knife when he was rummaging through the trash. This dog always walks me home and to school. He's a stray, but he's kind, never hurt anyone. Why did this happen to him? He needs help." Gwen sighed. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes. "Apparently he loved the dog very much, but I'm not a veterinarian, you see. Humans have a specific body structure. We have 2 hands, 2 legs. I was trained to treat people. Dogs are entirely different. Their bodies function differently. I just don't know how to treat animals." Gwen squatted down and wiped a tear from the boy's face. "So he'll die in my arms and you won't do anything," he cried. Gwen couldn't bear the child's tears. She herself desperately wanted a child, and she and Lucas had been trying for a long time, but the outcome was always the same: a miscarriage in the first trimester. She felt sorry for the boy. "Can't your stepdad take the dog to a veterinary clinic?" Gwen asked, already anticipating the answer. "He'll scold me, and that's it. He'll throw the dog out on the street. I brought him in while my stepdad isn't here to warm him up. He needs his wound treated and bandaged. I wanted to do it myself, but I don't have bandages." Gwen sighed. "All right, let's do this. I'll make a note in my records that I treated your wound and that you had a fever, and I'll help your dog. But I can't promise anything." "Okay, I agree," the boy said. Gwen examined the dog. It lay obediently, seeming to understand that they were trying to help. The stab wound was on its ribs, deep but probably not too severe. The bleeding was localized, and Gwen decided against stitching it. There was no real need. She cleaned the wound, bandaged it, and left some solution and bandages with the boy. The young animal rights advocate's name was Nicholas. "Thank you. I don't know what I would do without you." The boy hugged Gwen, and she smiled. It was so heartwarming. If only David knew what drove her here at the end of her shift, he would surely be furious. But she didn't care about his emotions. A call came in. She answered it and provided help, even if not to a human. It was still needed in this situation. She did everything she could to help. As Gwen approached the door, the key turned in it. A middle-aged, drunk man entered the apartment. "What's this all about?" he slurred. The boy tried to lie, saying he was sick. Gwen didn't know what to do, but suddenly a bandaged dog appeared from the room. "Did you call an ambulance to help the mutt?" "Well, I'll deal with you now." The stepfather tried to hit the child, but Gwen intervened. "No, don't. He just wanted to help," she said, "and he brought this stray into the house. Do you know what happens because of a false call?" He continued, trying to hit Nicholas, who dodged and took cover. "I won't report it. I helped the dog. We won't tell anyone." "Calm down. You won't get in trouble for this." Gwen tried to calm the drunkard, but he only grew angrier. "So you're an animal lover too, huh? Probably stole something on the sly while tending to the mongrel, huh? While you were busy with the mutt, adults weren't around and this bum let you into the house." The boy's stepfather lunged at her with his fists and almost hit her, but at that moment, David appeared behind him. In one swift move, he knocked the drunken thug onto the linoleum. "What do you think you're doing, man?" "Calm down," David said. The stepfather got scared and started to back away. "He didn't hit you, did he?" David asked Gwen. She shook her head. "If you squeak, I'll bury you." "Got it," David warned. He took Gwen by the hand and led her downstairs. She was going to fill out the hospital protocol on the way, right? That she was helping the boy, but decided to tell the truth since David saved so. Hearing that Gwen had been helping the dog all this time, he smirked. Well, you'll get a reprimand from the boss tomorrow. And I warned you." For some reason, she thought the driver would show some humanity now that he stood up for her. But David acted differently. He didn't file a complaint but told everything verbally, and the chief physician gave Gwen an unofficial reprimand, embarrassing her in front of the whole hospital. From that day on, they started calling her a veterinarian. She already had enough gossip and rumors, and now it got even worse. From that day on, their car became completely silent. Gwen stopped talking to David and even stopped saying hello. She didn't know how the story with Nicholas and the dog ended, but sometimes she remembered them. It was curious, but she didn't dare to go back there. She just hoped that the boy didn't suffer because of his love for animals. That evening, she was returning from work and stopped by the store. As she was leaving, she bumped into Nicholas. "Hi," Gwen smiled. "Hi, I'm glad I ran into you." The boy brightened up. He held a leash in his hand. The dog survived and apparently became his pet. "How are things?" Gwen asked. "The wound is healed already. I wanted to ask someone to call you. No, my friend had a collar. I found it on him. And 2 days ago, I noticed there was a phone number on it. I'd call from my stepfather's phone, but he's drunk it all away and I can't contact the owner. Otherwise, my stepfather doesn't allow me to keep the dog at home, and it's cold outside. What if someone's looking for him and misses him? Gwen sighed. Yes, you're right. Let's call if you want, but then they'll take the dog from you. Do you understand that? The boy shrugged and said sadly, he's been with me for half a year, and all this time I didn't notice there was a collar on him. It's made of quite expensive leather with a tag inserted. Maybe my dog has a real owner and I can't even feed him properly. I barely eat myself, and my stepfather drinks everything away. Gwen shook her head. All right then, let's go to the store now, and I'll buy you whatever you want. Then we'll call the dog's owner and do a good deed. What if some child is missing him? You're already grown up, right? We'll do the right thing. We've already saved the dog. Now let's take him back home. Nicholas smiled. Yes, I'm grown up. What if indeed some kid is looking for him? And will you buy me some candy too? His eyes lit up. Gwen bought him a whole bag of sweets and more. She wanted to cheer the boy up from the bottom of her heart. He didn't just decide to return the dog to its owner. He saved her life. He persuaded an educated adult to treat the injured animal. He didn't hesitate to bring the dog home, knowing that his stepfather would be angry. He was a very brave little man who was starting to appeal more and more to Gwen. Good day. I'm calling you about your dog, she said when someone answered the phone. Nicholas stood nearby, petting the dog. It was shaggy with kind eyes and a constantly wagging tail. Have you found Rex? The man on the other end of the line was incredibly relieved. Yes, we found him. A boy found him. We didn't notice the collar right away. Yes, that's right. Rex is very shaggy and now he's probably even more so. I'm the one who grooms him. If it's possible, please return the dog. He's my best friend. Any amount of money, anything you want. Gwen and Nicholas exchanged glances. Of course we'll return him. Money. No need for money. Can you come to the city park now? We're nearby. There was an awkward cough on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, I can't come, but I'll pay for your trip. Could you bring the dog? I really can't get out, Gwen shrugged. All right, give us the address. Soon Rex, Nicholas, and Gwen stood in front of a wealthy house in the city center. They rang the doorbell and waited for it to be answered. Rex wagged his tail happily and whined, scratching the door with his paws. He recognized his home. Sorry for taking so long. A man in a wheelchair opened the door. Gwen and Nicholas sighed. That's why he couldn't come. He was disabled. Rex happily leaped onto his owner and began licking his face. The man had blonde curly hair, tan smooth skin, and a charming smile. He wore glasses, a white sweater that Rex promptly dirtied, but the owner didn't seem to mind. Please come in. I want you to tell me how you met Rex. Where has he been all this time? Nicholas and Gwen entered the house. Apparently there was no one else there except the owner. Nicholas told how he first met Rex, how he saw the stray stabbed with a knife while climbing out of a dumpster. Gwen told how she responded to the call, how she defended the boy from his stepfather. At this point, Daryl frowned. You know what? I'll give you a mobile phone. Keep it secret and in silent mode so your stepfather won't take it away. And if you get hungry or need any help, you call me, okay? You helped me, and I really want to help you. Be your friend? Okay, Nicholas shrugged. That's a great idea. Then let's save my number in there too. I'll call you sometimes. You call too if you get sick or need anything. Gwen picked up on the idea. They talked for almost an hour, after which Daryl called a taxi and insisted on paying for the ride. Rex instantly felt at home. He settled in the corner where a soft chair used to be. After Gwen and Nicholas left, Daryl was left alone with the dog. Dreamily, he stroked his head and asked, So, where did you find this miracle? The girl is just beautiful, and the boy is so wonderful. And Rex, you're making friends so quickly. Soon, his wife entered. She was a redhead in heels with a manicure. Oh my God, what's this mutt doing here? She exclaimed from the doorway. Rex happily greeted the mistress of the house, jumping on her with his front paws. Daryl sat aside. His wife didn't notice him right away. Didn't I tell you to take this damn thing to hell? She addressed the dog. Daryl heard this. Yes, and you're angry, but you should have removed the collar. It has my phone number on it, Daryl responded. Elizabeth flinched. She realized she had blundered by saying that aloud. Yes, I threw away your mutt, but it's not even a purebred, Daryl, and it's always tearing my tights with its claws. I hate this dog. Daryl smiled. You've been lying to me all this time, helping put up posters. What a terrible person you are, Elizabeth. I never thought you were capable of this. You could have at least taken the dog to the shelter. As if I didn't know. You check all of them. Next time I'll throw your money into the river. She spat venomously and stormed off to her room, the click of her heels echoing. Dogs can swim, he yelled after her, thinking to himself, what a fool. Daryl and Elizabeth's relationship didn't improve. Almost immediately, she was younger, headstrong. She liked that he had his own car and his own house. Daryl wisely invested his savings and became a businessman, starting his own business from scratch. He had a wealthy pen pal, Gold, whom he met in school and never stopped communicating with. This friend lived on the other side of the country. He advised Daryl, taught him how to invest money wisely and increase his wealth. He taught the intricacies of business, how to deal with taxes, compile reports in general. He taught his friend a lot. Everything he knew, and Daryl became successful in a short time. They met in person several times. Gold had a family, children. He was happy. Daryl also wanted a family, but he rushed into it. It didn't work out like with his business because love can't be artificially induced. It either exists or it doesn't. He found a beautiful girl who also hung on to him, and after just 4 months of dating, they got married. Elizabeth was thrilled with this turn of events, but Daryl soon began to realize that marriages aren't built like this, and love isn't chosen. He confessed to Gold that he envied his happiness and also decided to get married, but now he regretted his decision. Friend, that's not how it works. My wife and I had so many obstacles in our way. We fought and almost broke up. Our families fought us, her ex kept interfering, and now we're together but we still argue. However, I understand that I still love her anyway. I didn't seek love, it just happened. And it will happen to you too. It's good that you realized you made a mistake in time. I advise you to break up with her. But now, it wouldn't be fair. She loves me. You were your money, you said yourself. She's materialistic and arrogant. One doesn't exclude the other. She says she loves me, she cries when we argue. Well, I don't know. If you're unhappy with her, it's better to tell her directly. I wouldn't want someone to date me out of pity. This conversation took place 2 years ago. All this time, Daryl couldn't bring himself to end the relationship. Sometimes it seemed like he got used to it, almost started to love Elizabeth, but then everything returned to normal. The relationship deteriorated, went downhill, but neither of them ended it. Since the accident when Daryl ended up in a wheelchair, everything became even worse. He almost died. Elizabeth was scared for him. She didn't leave his bedside, but when the doctor said he wouldn't walk again, she distanced herself sharply. She didn't help him with anything, and it was as if she blamed him for not being able to go everywhere with her like before. Living with someone confined to a wheelchair is difficult, and Elizabeth didn't hide it. She didn't like this kind of life. Daryl kept waiting for her to break up with him on her own, but for some reason she didn't leave, apparently because of the money. Since Gwen and Nicholas brought the dog to Daryl, 3 weeks had passed. Outside, everything was blooming and smelled of spring. April was in full swing. Cool nights were replaced by warm, sunny days. Love was in the air. Gwen called Nicholas almost every day, as did Daryl. The boy told him about her, and she about him. They didn't communicate directly, but through the boy they knew everything about each other. Daryl desperately wanted to ask Nicholas for her phone number, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Gwen seemed so unapproachable to him, although she was also interested in Daryl, but she wasn't the type to impose herself on a man. She was firmly convinced that if he wanted, he would find her number and find her himself, and if not, then he didn't want it that much. That day, Daryl called Nicholas again. He decided to ask the boy if Gwen had a husband or fiancé. He would take him as an accomplice and confess that he really liked her. Maybe Nicholas would bring them together. The boy was smart, but he couldn't raise the subject. Nicholas was crying when Daryl called him. What happened? Can you talk now? Daryl asked. My stepfather beat me. Why? Because I refused to go out. He wants me to beg for money on the street after school, and then he'll buy cigarettes and booze with that money. But I don't want to. I begged for money once, but I was so ashamed. And my classmates saw me and told everyone. I don't want it to be like that. He's making you beg. Daryl was shocked. Yes, I'll be there soon, he said and hung up. Meanwhile, Nicholas wondered how he would arrive. After all, he was in a wheelchair. However, Daryl could arrange for a special vehicle to be called for him. The driver arrived at Nicholas's house and, upon the passenger's request, went up to the second floor and then knocked on the door. Nicholas's stepfather opened it and gruffly asked, What do you want? They're asking you to come down. Someone wants to talk to you. I'm not going anywhere. If someone wants to talk to me, they can come here themselves, the stepfather retorted. I must insist. Someone who is confined to a wheelchair is asking you to come down. He has a serious matter to discuss with you. It won't take much time, the driver explained. The stepfather slammed the door in his face. The driver returned, shrugging his shoulders. He refused, he reported. All right, sighed Daryl. He called his security guard from the office. The guard arrived in 20 minutes, went up to the second floor, and knocked on the door again. I already told you I'm not going anywhere, not for any handicapped person. Go away, the stepfather exclaimed, before being cut off. The guard grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the entrance. Daryl sat in the parked car. Good day. Sorry we had to resort to force, but there was no other way to talk to you. You don't have a mobile phone. As I understand, Daryl began. The stepfather introduced himself as George. Daryl explained that he knew Nicholas and wanted to protect him. If I ever see a bruise on his body, I'll come, and my guard will be with me then. It won't be me talking, it'll be him, and he's mute, just so you know. Doesn't talk, if you catch my drift. Nicholas will never beg for arms, and you will find a job and provide for your child. I want him to be fed, clothed, and to have a childhood. I can strip you of parental rights in a heartbeat, but you don't want that, as I understand it. You need child support for him, don't you? George nodded. All right then. Don't push things to the limit. Have I made myself clear? George was angry, his cheeks flushed, but Daryl's guard was twice his size and made it clear that it was better not to mess with him. From that day on, Daryl visited Nicholas's house several times. He took the boy away, but first he called George. Now George always came downstairs. I'll take Nicholas to the park, you don't mind. I'll bring him back in a couple of hours, Daryl would say. Fine, George would shrug, while internally seething and wondering why a rich man in a wheelchair would want his stepson a couple of times. Daryl brought Nicholas to his house to play with Rex. Elizabeth saw the boy and was extremely displeased with his presence in the house. She didn't greet him, ignored him, thinking Daryl was simply going mad, befriending a little boy of all things. One day, Daryl's driver asked to leave early, and Daryl called George. Daryl gave him a simple mobile phone to stay in touch. He said if the boy ever needed help, George could always contact him. George was afraid to send Daryl away. Besides, Daryl helped him take care of the boy by buying clothes, playing with him, and taking him to the park. What's there to be offended about? Kindness and help, George thought. George wasn't a monster, of course. He wanted a good childhood for Nicholas, but his alcohol dependency, laziness, and nasty character prevented him from overcoming himself. He never got a job, only took odd jobs. Some money was coming in, but it was never enough. George, could you take a taxi and come get Nicholas? I'm afraid to let him go alone. I'll pay for the ride, Daryl asked. George had just returned from work. He took a shower and got a beer from the fridge. He really wanted to curse Daryl out, but he gritted his teeth and said he'd come soon. George was at the doorstep of the rich man's house. Nicholas was getting ready to leave. And you, I assume, are the boy's father? Elizabeth asked indifferently. She was, as always, beautiful and smelled delicious. Yes, I'm the stepfather. Doesn't it bother you that my husband has become so attached to him? And you? They looked at each other and quickly realized they were on the same side. Yes, it's a nightmare. Why does he need someone else's child? It's abnormal. Why don't you forbid him? He threatened me with his bodyguard, and he also said he could strip me of my parental rights, George replied. Yes, Daryl can do that. All his friends are lawyers and judges. So what should we do? Elizabeth asked. Well, I have a few thoughts on that. Shall we have dinner sometime? Elizabeth smiled. George smirked. He wore an old leather jacket, his dark hair tousled. Apparently she liked him. He looked all rough, unlike that intellectual in the wheelchair. Agreed, but I'm short on cash right now. No problem. I'll pay. Elizabeth smiled knowingly. So, Daryl's wife found an ally. She had long dreamed of leaving her husband but didn't know how to do it without losing money. Plus, she didn't want to be alone. Elizabeth couldn't find a worthy replacement for Daryl, but she always had a weakness for bad boys, and George caught her eye. They met shortly after that and discussed their thoughts. George said he would like to settle the score with Daryl. Elizabeth said she didn't mind. It would be much more profitable for her to become a widow than to divorce. They sat in a restaurant, George holding Elizabeth's hand and gazing into her eyes tenderly. She melted under his piercing brown gaze. George had cleaned himself up for this meeting. He shaved. He was one of those men who instantly made an impression, quite handsome, middle-aged. Elizabeth wasn't bothered by his drinking and unemployment. She was instantly smitten. You know, I'd be happy to become a widow, but I'm a bit delicate. If you could, she smiled, gazing into his eyes. You're a real man, it shows. I can if you want, but it's serious business. Will you regret it later? He's your husband, not a stranger. I'll take him out now, and then you'll start crying, blaming me. I don't want to end up in jail, me. I don't care about that wimp. I hate him, just so you know. I don't need him. He just gets in the way. In case of divorce, I'll get almost nothing since he started the business before the wedding, and everything belongs only to him. We have no children. The apartment is also bought before the marriage. I'll take only my things, but I want to stay in this house with someone who will truly appreciate me, she smiled, stroking his hand. Yes, a woman like you should be appreciated. You deserve better. Ah. They spent a long time in the restaurant, then went to a motel to get to know each other better. Elizabeth returned home from there around midnight. She had never stayed out so late before, and Daryl realized she had probably been with someone else. He expected that, as he himself was now disabled. It didn't hurt. He just hoped she would gather her things and want to leave. But it didn't turn out that way. In the morning, Elizabeth said she wasn't satisfied with their cleaner. This is already the third one. What didn't you like about Mrs. Wright? She's been with us for almost a year. I think she's perfect, not too pretty, so you wouldn't be jealous like with Wendy. No children, so she doesn't take sick days like with Victoria. But what's the matter now? Yesterday, the boy's father, whom you've been feeding, came here, so he doesn't have a steady job. I think it would be much more beneficial if you hired George. If you want to help the child, get his father a job, and Mrs. Wright can stay part-time. She'll take care of the house, and George can take care of the yard and garden, and the boy will be with you more often since you want that. Daryl sighed. He saw that Elizabeth and George had exchanged a few words yesterday. Of course, he guessed that Elizabeth didn't just decide to help him out of the blue. He also guessed that they probably spent the previous night together, but he didn't really care about her. Giving George a job wasn't a bad idea after all. Will he agree? This guy doesn't seem to like working much. He'll agree. I talked to him about it yesterday. He just can't find the right job. Okay, I'll give him a call. Daryl shrugged. I'll call him myself, Elizabeth said, walking out, her head held high. She didn't even try to pretend she wasn't interested in this man. She made it clear she had his phone number. Daryl sighed with relief. It seemed like things were moving towards a resolution. Let her go to that juror already or to someone else, yes, anywhere. He couldn't bring himself to end it himself. He felt guilty and responsible. After all, he was the one who married her. George started working in Daryl's house. He was taciturn and did everything he was asked to do. He came and left on time. Daryl noticed a couple of times that George came out of his wife's bedroom looking a bit disheveled. He understood there was something between them but chose to ignore it. He didn't really care. Elizabeth, on the other hand, tried to provoke jealousy in him, hoping to elicit some emotions from him. Hope still lingered within her, but her husband's indifference drove her to extremes. She said she had made up her mind and wanted George to remove Daryl from the picture. That day, Daryl sent the driver to fetch Nicholas. George worked in the garden. Nicholas arrived, took Rex, and went for a walk with him. The weather outside was bad cold again, with strong winds and occasional rain. Daryl, as usual, went out into the yard. The path by the pool, which George had cleaned not long ago, was slightly sloping. Daryl instinctively pressed the brakes to avoid falling into the water, but the brakes didn't work. Daryl tried to grab with his hands, but under the weight of his body, the wheelchair rolled forward. Daryl realized he was about to fall, started calling for help, but there was no one around. The wheelchair rolled onto the tiles and toppled into the water. Daryl found himself in icy water, the wheelchair covering him from above. He choked, feeling a blow to his back, unable to feel his legs but understanding that they were dragging him down like a stone. Daryl tried to swim out. He somehow managed to get out from under the heavy wheelchair and surfaced, gasping for air. After that, he was pulled down again. If only his legs aided him. His sweater was already wet, water filling his lungs. He coughed, surfacing only for short moments, then sinking back into the cold water. His muffled cries yielded no result. He knew Elizabeth and George were somewhere nearby but couldn't see them, observing him drown from the living room window. Just a little more, and it's done. Will you regret it later? I can pull him out if you want, before it's too late, George said. No, I won't regret it. I'll even open a bottle of champagne for this occasion. They stood there indifferently, watching Daryl struggle for his life. At that moment, the gate in the backyard opened, and Rex rushed in like a hurricane, immediately jumping into the pool. Nicholas followed suit. He also jumped into the water without hesitation and helped Daryl reach the edge. I can't pull you out. You're heavy, Nicholas said, shivering from the cold. He made several attempts to lift Daryl, who was already shivering and had swallowed water. Run into the house. Get your stepfather. He'll help. Go call him. But won't you drown? Nicholas worriedly asked, getting out of the pool. No, run. I'm holding on to the edge. Being in the icy water was unbearable. Nicholas ran into the kitchen, where his father pretended to be fixing a faucet. Elizabeth had already gone upstairs. They both saw that their plan was ruined by Nicholas and Rex. Help, quickly. Daryl fell into the pool. George rushed to help Daryl with a concerned look. Daryl thanked his savior. They retrieved his wheelchair from the pool. However, all this time, Daryl sat outside in wet clothes and caught a cold. He started feeling ill when he finally made it to the shower. That evening, Elizabeth and George were sitting in a cafe near the house. Daryl was in bed, shivering. Maybe it's for the best we didn't take any guilt on our souls. I could have finished him off, of course. I could have done it myself, but it's disgusting, George admitted. Yes, I'm glad he's alive too, but I really hope he dies of pneumonia. Then we'll definitely be in the clear, Elizabeth said. Daryl's illness allowed Elizabeth to take control of the business. She fed him fake tablets, passing them off as antibiotics, while he only got worse. She asked him for power of attorneys to sign documents, promising to obey the manager whom Daryl trusted as himself. However, when Elizabeth took his place, everything fell into her hands. She immediately transferred a large sum from reserve accounts to herself and went shopping. When asked where to sign, she did it. She even bothered to go to a lawyer and consulted on how to transfer the company to herself. She decided to become the owner and bypass Daryl without committing murder. Why dirty her hands? By that time, Daryl was getting worse. Nicholas also caught a cold and didn't visit him for a week. After that incident, when the boy came to him that day, he saw Daryl delirious, with a high fever, lying alone in bed. Nicholas immediately remembered Gwen and dialed her number. At that moment, she was at work, returning from a call. Nicholas told her what had happened, and Gwen rushed over. David wasn't with her anymore. He had found another job and quit. There was another driver in his place, accommodating and reasonable, so working became much easier. Daryl opened his eyes and saw Gwen sitting up and administering a drip for him. "Am I dead or did I make it to heaven?" he smiled. "Not yet, but you would have been. Why didn't you call me?" Nicholas said. "You've been sick for a week. Don't you know there's emergency help, doctor?" She scolded him. He seriously neglected himself, and it could have ended fatally. "Well, Elizabeth gave me some pills. I don't know what she gave you, but your condition is awful. Are you going to the hospital?" she asked. "Can I hire you instead? Can you treat me at home?" "Come over when you have time." "All right," Gwen replied. "That's fine. But if you don't improve in the next day, I'll have to take you to the hospital. And also, I would like to do an X-ray for you." She started taking care of Daryl's health. Elizabeth, seeing the young, pretty doctor, got upset. Several times she made sarcastic remarks, but Gwen didn't care. Nicholas told her that Daryl's stepmother and wife were always angry. They whispered about something, locking themselves together. "Don't you think your wheelchair brakes failed not by accident?" Gwen asked. She was sitting up, administering the drip for him. "I had such thoughts. We should get divorced. After all, this won't work. We didn't just fall out of love. I think she started to hate me. Maybe I deserved it. Maybe I didn't become a good husband for her. But we can't continue living under the same roof with such circumstances." Gwen questioned Daryl detail about his injury. "It turns out surgery was possible, but Daryl doesn't tolerate anesthesia well. He has chronic illnesses and bodily peculiarities that complicate any surgical intervention, and in the case of his spine, a serious multi-hour operation is needed. I'm just scared," he admitted. "Aren't you afraid to live your whole life like this, knowing it could have been different? And there's always a risk you could have died today, right on this day or on that one. You would have died if I hadn't come." Daryl pondered. Elizabeth instilled in him the opposite. If you don't want to die, except that she was against the operation, citing that she was very worried about him, especially when Daryl almost died in the accident. But listening to the advice of a caring medic, who also really cares about your health, seemed reasonable. The thought of the operation never left his mind. He constantly imagined himself standing up, returning to normal life. One small hope for this made him smile. The second reason for smiling was Gwen. They grew very close while she was treating him. When Gwen finished the treatment, Daryl was already determined. He went to the hospital, took tests, and got a doctor's opinion. Surgery is indicated, but there may be complications. There are no guarantees, but there is approximately a 60% chance that after the intervention, Daryl will be able to walk. The surgery was scheduled for Thursday morning. It was May, a sunny day. Daryl woke up at 5 in the morning and couldn't fall asleep. He kept looking out the window, thinking, what if this is the last day? What if another morning doesn't come? Gwen came to him. Nicholas came too. The hospital was private. Nicholas hugged him and said that everything would definitely be fine. Gwen, however, asked Nicholas to leave them alone. "You know, from our first meeting I realized that you are a very good person. I didn't tell you and I wouldn't have. But now I must. The thing is, you mean a lot to me." "Wait, hold on. You want to say this because I might die right now? I'm just very anxious. I want you to know that you've become very important to me." "Hold on," he interrupted again. "Tell me when I wake up. I have a lot to say to you too, but after the operation." Okay, Gwen held his hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. At that moment, a doctor entered the room. Soon Daryl was wheeled away on a stretcher. A year has passed since then. Every day Gwen woke up with a heavy heart. It was she who persuaded him to have the surgery back then. If only she had known that he wouldn't wake up after the anesthesia. The first few days, when the doctor said that Daryl had fallen into a coma, she spent in the hospital. His wife called only once and asked to be notified if her husband woke up or died. Learning about this, Gwen stopped tormenting herself with guilt for falling in love with a married man. His wife, however, was different. She hoped Daryl would wake up. She believed she came every day. Once she met Elizabeth in the corridor. "What are you doing here?" she asked disdainfully. "Me? Taking care of Daryl," Gwen replied, looking straight into Elizabeth's eyes. "Taking care of my husband. No one else. He's a very lonely person," Gwen replied. Elizabeth shrugged. "Fine, take him. I came for a doctor's note. I'm filing for divorce. Just keep in mind that from this day on I become the rightful owner of everything. The house and the business will pass to me. By the way, George said that you and Daryl were looking after that boy together. You can take him if you want. George is planning to send him to an orphanage, but if you want you can try to adopt him. We don't need other people's baggage. Gwen was stunned. What a turn of events. What audacity. And where do they make such poor imitations of a human being? It seems like you look at her 2 hands and 2 legs, just like everyone else, but inside, there's a huge black hole instead of a soul. Daryl didn't wake up on the 3rd or 10th day. At first, life support was maintained using his own funds, to which his work assistant had access. But the hospital where Daryl lay was private, which meant it wasn't cheap. When the money ran out, Gwen turned to Elizabeth. After all, she started managing everything Daryl had. Elizabeth refused and even personally came to the clinic to ask for him to be disconnected from the life support machine. She wanted to put an end to it and become the sole legal owner of the house and business. Daryl's assistant visited him every day. He continued to manage the affairs for a long time, and then Elizabeth fired him. Daryl has a friend. Call him. I'll give you the phone. His name is Askold. They've been friends since childhood. He's a very wealthy man, he said, and gave Gwen the phone number. By that time, Gwen had already quit her job and got a job as a nurse at the private clinic where Daryl lay in a coma. This way, she could be closer to him. For a while, she paid for his stay in the ward, but money was catastrophically short. Nicholas and Rex lived with her. She took the boy and explained the whole situation to the women from social services, and they helped Gwen become his guardian. Now Nicholas lived in normal conditions. Gwen helped him with his lessons and dressed him. That day, Gwen came to work as usual for the evening shift. Nicholas also came with her. Rex was left in the yard tied to a pole, but he was behaving very restlessly. Gwen didn't see how the dog broke the leash and rushed into the hospital, scaring the guard. He rushed after the dog. Gwen was already approaching the ward when Rex nearly knocked her over. He ran inside and started barking wildly. Gwen was the first to arrive and saw such a scene. Rex was lunging at Elizabeth, who was cornered in the corner. One of the wires was disconnected from the life support machine. I just came to visit Daryl. Get rid of this mutt. Is this a hospital or a zoo? Elizabeth was indignant. Gwen calmly approached the machine and restored everything as it was. You disconnected the monitor. You should have pulled out the other wire. This one. Gwen pointed to the thick black cord leading to the machine. Elizabeth was still standing by the wall. Rex was barking at her, not letting her move. I didn't disconnect anything. Elizabeth burst into the room and tore the wires. Elizabeth stomped on the dog, and Rex backed away. She raised her head and walked past. So, Rex saved Daryl's life. He seemed to sense trouble, and finding the word wasn't difficult for him. Gwen sometimes brought him to the hospital at night, hoping that the dog would lick Daryl's hand and he would wake up. Gwen told the head doctor about this story, and he ordered to print out a photo of Elizabeth from the surveillance cameras and not to let her in anymore. But you understand it's not affordable for you alone to maintain him. You'll have to make arrangements with another clinic or disconnect him, and I advise the latter option. Let him go. It's been a year already. There's hardly any chance, the head doctor sympathetically pronounced. That same day, Askold called back. Don't disconnect him for anything. Daryl will fight as long as it takes. I'll send the check immediately, he shouted into the receiver. I'll come, just don't disconnect him. Gwen was so relieved. At the moment of the conversation, she was in the hospital room when Askold hung up. She took Daryl's hand. Well, your friend will help us. Askold said he'd come and pay for the room. Daryl, sweetheart, come back to us. Both I, Rex, Nicholas, and Askold, yes, many people from your job miss you. We love you. I love you, she said. At that moment, Daryl's hand twitched. He opened his eyelids slightly. The monitor showed changes in his pulse and pressure. Daryl woke up. It took him a long time to come to himself. Recovery from the operation was difficult. He spent 4 months in the hospital before he could return home. Gwen was by his side all this time, and Elizabeth had to move out of Daryl's house, but she managed to take over his business. Daryl wasn't ready to work yet, but Askold had already issued him a check for a large sum so that his friend could rise from the ashes and start over. Askold came personally as soon as he found out that Daryl had regained consciousness. He met Gwen. This is the kind of girl you need. I think she really loves you. Not like it was with Elizabeth, he said. Daryl nodded. I think I love her too. Starting from scratch was hard. Daryl was still weak and still in a wheelchair. However, he could feel both of his legs and was gradually recovering. The operation was successful, but waking up from anesthesia turned out to be very difficult. A year later, when Daryl was already standing on his own with a cane, Elizabeth appeared on the doorstep of his house. She was still beautiful, but her gaze was different, troubled. Do you remember your partners? Today they stormed into our house with George and turned everything upside down. Why did you even work with gangsters? What are we going to do now? The business is ruined. They say they'll kill George. Daryl took off his glasses and looked carefully at his ex-wife. I knew who I was getting involved with, but I never borrowed from them. We settled up immediately and honestly split the profits. Talk to them. They respect you. Me with them? About what? You stole my business, and now you're saying you're having problems and asking for help. Just give back the money, Elizabeth, and everything will be fine. But I don't have it. If I go into debt, we'll be bankrupt. Do you want me to lend you money? Elizabeth looked him in the eyes. Asking him was audacious on her part. Can you? We'll pay it back honestly. Sorry, I can't and don't want to. Don't come back. Okay, Daryl said calmly. He said it kindly, without anger. Elizabeth left. She didn't know that on that very day, Gwen and Daryl had submitted an application to the registry office and were preparing to celebrate this event. They had no time for Elizabeth and her problems, and later they found out that Elizabeth and George had failed. They had to get into debt and sell everything they had to settle with serious people. On this basis, they went their separate ways. Elizabeth quickly found herself a new man. This time, her chosen one was a 60-year-old businessman. Everyone understood that she was with him only for the money, including the man himself, but he didn't care. Elizabeth was a beautiful doll for him, a symbol of prosperity. She made him feel young again, but he didn't rush to marry her and apparently didn't plan to. As for George, having tasted the rich life, he also didn't want to return to his shabby apartment and began a romance with a wealthy married woman. At first with one, then with another. He didn't remember Nicholas, didn't call or visit. He had huge debts, so George constantly changed his place of residence. He even bought himself a fake passport to hide from creditors. He became a professional playboy, but as soon as he managed to get some money from some foolish, in-love lady, George immediately, it backfired on him. He never managed to buy himself a house or a car. The maximum he could afford was more expensive things to impress another elderly lady. Gwen and Daryl officially adopted Nicholas. Gwen confessed that she couldn't have a child and told about her unsuccessful attempts in her first marriage. Daryl said they would adopt a baby. In the worst case, they would use the services of a surrogate mother. In this case, they still had a chance for another child. However, they soon found out that Gwen was 3 months pregnant. It happened naturally, and the pregnancy went quite smoothly. After the due date, Gwen gave birth to a healthy girl weighing 3,800 grams. Daryl was the happiest father. By that time, the business already fully covered their expenses and allowed them to live without need. But Gwen's pregnancy wasn't a surprise for this couple. Once, Daryl decided that his son would want to know about his biological parents. He began to search for information and discovered that Gwen's biological mother's sister had given birth to a daughter long ago and left her husband. She was raised in her father's family and had no ties with her mother's family. She was the one who gave birth to Nicholas and, like her mother once, left a child with his father, or rather with her stepfather, who didn't dare to send Nicholas to an orphanage. Since he himself grew up in a shelter, he decided it was better to have him somehow than there, especially when they paid benefits. Gwen became an aunt to Nicholas. She didn't want to search for her cousin, there was no need for it. Nicholas himself said that he would always consider Daryl and Gwen his parents. He wouldn't search for other parents. The boy was happy when Gwen gave birth to his little sister, little Judith. The baby was remarkably calm and smiling like Daryl. He was like that in childhood. Daryl dreamed of having another son with Gwen, and she wasn't against it either. The doctors explained that it was most likely due to incompatibility with George, not Gwen's infertility. She turned out to be perfectly healthy. Nicholas was happy with Daryl. Gwen adored her sister, loved taking walks with her, and Rex was always there, protecting the family from any danger.